The smell of expensive lilies and the pop of champagne corks filled the hallway. But inside the office, the air had turned to ice. Marjorie stared at the man in the scuffed leather jacket who had just slammed a stack of crumpled debt slips onto her oak desk, his knuckles white and a snarling dog tattoo pulsing on his wrist. Outside, the city's elite were cheering her name. But here, the rhythmic, sickly green light of a deserted computer monitor revealed a balance of nearly zero where millions should have been. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling against the cold glass. But every call to her closest partner went straight to a mechanical drone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Detroit looked like scattered diamonds. Yet Marjorie felt the walls closing in as she realized her own digital signature was stamped at the bottom of every ruinous transaction. The federal auditors were arriving in 72 hours, and the man with the skeletal hands wasn't leaving without his money. One wrong word at the gala tonight wouldn't just end her career. It would be the first shovel of dirt on her grave. Marjorie Langston stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of her corner office, the lights of downtown Detroit shimmering like scattered diamonds against the velvet dark. She reached up, adjusting the heavy strand of pearls resting against her collarbone, their weight a familiar comfort. The air in the room carried the cloying, sweet scent of fresh-cut lilies and the expensive, musky notes of her own perfume. On the massive oak desk, wicker baskets overflowing with champagne bottles and gold-embossed cards from the city's elite crowded the workspace. Every few minutes, the door creaked open as her secretary peered in, face beaming, offering yet another breathless compliment regarding the 20th anniversary gala of the new Detroit Foundation. Marjorie smoothed the front of her silk dress, the fabric cool and fluid against her palms. From the corridor, the muffled pop of corks and the melodic chime of crystal glasses signaled the beginning of the celebration. She caught her reflection in the window, tall, composed, and successful, and allowed a thin smile to touch her lips, anticipating the flashbulbs and the accolades that awaited her. The double doors of the office didn't just open. They slammed against the interior walls with a violence that sent the vase of lilies dancing across the oak surface. A man lunged into the room, draped in a scuffed leather coat that reeked of stale tobacco and the sour tang of old sweat. Marjorie's fingers went limp, her gold fountain pen clattering to the floor as the stranger heaved a thick stack of crumpled debt slips onto the polished desk. He leaned forward, his knuckles white and skeletal as they pressed into the wood, the veins in his neck bulging like thick cords. His voice, a jagged rasp that tore through the festive hum of the hallway, demanded the immediate return of millions lost by Arthur Pratt. Marjorie shrank into the upholstery of her chair, her eyes fixed on the tattoo on the man's wrist. A snarling dog, teeth bared in a permanent threat. The celebration outside continued, but inside the room, the air turned frigid and heavy. Marjorie's hand shook as she gripped her smartphone, the cold glass casing pressing painfully against her ear. She listened to the rhythmic, indifferent drone of the dial tone, a sound that seemed to mock her growing panic. 3 times she punched in Arthur Pratt's private number, and 3 times the mechanical voice of the automated system informed her that the subscriber was unavailable. She bolted into the reception area, her heels clicking frantically on the linoleum, only to find the treasurer's workstation deserted. A lukewarm cup of coffee sat on Arthur's desk, a gray, oily film already congealing on its surface, while his computer monitor flickered with a rhythmic, sickly green light in the shadows. Marjorie yanked open the coat closet, finding it empty of his wool overcoat. The silence in the small office felt heavy, a physical weight that pressed against her chest as the first stirrings of disaster coiled in her gut. Her fingers danced a frantic, uneven rhythm across the laptop keys, the blue glare of the screen reflecting in her dilated pupils. when the banking portal for the new Detroit Foundation's reserve fund finally flickered into life. The air left Marjorie's lungs in a sharp hiss. In the space where an 8-figure sum should have resided, the available balance displayed a pitiful few $100s. She rubbed her eyes until they burned, desperate to find a system error or a server lag. But the digits remained static and cruel. A cold sweat broke across her shoulder blades, soaking into the fine silk of her chemise. Her throat tightened, a physical spasm of nausea rising as she stared at the yawning financial abyss that had replaced the lifeblood of her organization. The red numbers on the screen seemed to pulse, a digital heartbeat of a dying dream. The scroll wheel of the mouse clicked beneath her finger as Marjorie traced the endless ribbon of outgoing transactions. Every line of data felt like a physical blow to her midsection. The transfers were systematic, occurring precisely at 3 a.m. when the city was a graveyard. She watched as recurring sums, each followed by 5 or 6 zeros, vanished into offshore accounts over the span of the last 3 weeks. Her eyes locked onto the timestamps. Arthur had been methodically gutting the foundation while she slept or drifted in the quiet of a midnight bath. Despite the hum of the air conditioner, the office felt stifling, the oxygen seemingly sucked out by the weight of the theft. The dry, clinical rows of numbers formed a death warrant, one she found herself reading over and over, as if the words might change. Marjorie yanked at the bottom drawer of Arthur's desk, the wood letting out a sharp, protesting shriek. Buried beneath a heap of glossy investment brochures, she unearthed a handful of damp, crumpled receipts from a place called the Golden Horseshoe. The paper exhaled a scent of trapped cigarette smoke and cheap rye, the edges stained with greasy thumbprints. She sorted through the slips from the underground casino, discovering handwritten notes on the back, projections of losses and desperate bets in Arthur's unmistakable, sloping script. Her heart skipped a beat as she cross-referenced the dates. They aligned perfectly with the midnight siphoning of the Foundation's accounts. She crushed one of the slips in her fist, the sharp, thermal paper slicing into her palm and leaving a thin, red line of blood. The door creaked open, and Arthur Pratt stumbled in, his shoulder catching the frame for support. His shirt had escaped his waistband, his tie hung like a noose around his neck, and deep, violet shadows bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding Marjorie's stare while his hands performed a frantic, uncontrollable tremor. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry rattle, delivering the words that shattered her world. The entire grant, the future of the children, was gone, swallowed by a poker table. Marjorie watched him collapse into a chair, his face disappearing behind grime-streaked palms. The air surrounding him was thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and the pungent musk of a man who had reached the end of his rope. Marjorie pulled a stack of electronic ledgers toward her, the tips of her fingers feeling numb and distant. At the bottom of every page, the blue stamp of digital authorization glowed with a sickening permanence. Her own name stared back at her from the screen, a digital signature confirming every ruinous transfer Arthur had initiated. The realization hit her with the force of a physical impact. Arthur had used her personal access token, the one she kept in the small office safe. Every signature felt like a brand seared into her skin, a mark of complicity. She reached out, her thumb brushing the screen as if she could wipe the name away, but the pixels remained fixed. A single thought hammered against her skull. To any investigator, to any judge, Marjorie Langston was the one who had pressed send. A sharp rap on the door caused Marjorie to jump, her hand slamming the laptop lid shut. The secretary appeared in the doorway, a bright, professional smile plastered across her face, and a leather-bound planner in her hand. The girl's voice was chipper as she reminded Marjorie that the federal audit was scheduled for Monday morning, exactly 3 days away. Marjorie watched as the girl circled the date with a red marker, the sound of the felt-tip pen against the paper screeching like a blade on glass. Marjorie forced her facial muscles into a grotesque imitation of a smile, though her skin felt like cooling wax. When the door finally clicked shut, she stared at the calendar, the numbers of the countdown beginning to throb before her eyes, stripping away the last illusion of time. Marjorie lunged across the desk, her fingers digging into the lapels of Arthur's rumpled suit jacket, shaking him with a sudden, desperate strength. She demanded he tell her where the money was, how it could be retrieved, but he only slumped in her grip, his eyes glazed and vacant. He turned his pockets inside out, a few copper cents and a plastic lighter clattering onto the thick carpet. She realized then that he had nothing left. No property, no secret accounts, no car that wasn't already leveraged. The gambling addiction had been a black hole, consuming everything he touched. Arthur's skin looked gray and translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. She released him, her hands dropping to her sides as she understood that squeezing him for the money was as futile as trying to draw water from a sun-bleached stone. She ripped a sheet of paper from a legal pad and began to scrawl names with such force that the lead of the pencil snapped. Marjorie combed through her memory, searching for old acquaintances, ruthless politicians, and shadow market financiers who could move millions over a single weekend. The page became a map of her personal hell, populated by people she had spent 20 years promising to avoid. She bit her lip until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, calculating the predatory interest rates and the soul-crushing favors these men would demand in exchange for a lifeline. The phone in her hand felt like a glowing coal, yet she continued to build the list, her eyes darting to the clock. The second hand swept forward, a silent scythe cutting through the hours remaining for her reputation. Marjorie stepped out of the stifling lobby of the foundation, the evening air of Detroit hitting her like a damp shroud. The hum of the building's climate control was replaced by the low, predatory rumble of an engine idling in the shadows of a nearby alley. She lengthened her stride, the sharp staccato of her heels echoing off the wet pavement. But a black sedan with ink-dark windows drifted out of the gloom to match her pace. The vehicle glided parallel to her, navigating the oily puddles that reflected the sickly yellow of the street lamps. A cold current of electricity traced its way down her spine, and her fingers tightened around the leather strap of her handbag. The reflection of the sedan's headlights danced across the darkened storefronts, a silent shadow that followed her to the very edge of the parking garage. A massive silhouette detached itself from a concrete support pillar, stepping into the path between Marjorie and her car. She froze, the overhead security light catching the blue ink of a snarling dog on the man's forearm. The collector moved closer, bringing with him the heavy scent of rancid oil and a cheap, chemical cologne. He rested a heavy hand on the roof of her vehicle, the metal groaning and dipping under his weight. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed in a tin can. He promised her a set of broken ribs if Arthur Pratt's debt wasn't settled by the end of the weekend. Marjorie pressed her back against the cold glass of the driver's side window, the frantic thudding of her own heart vibrating through her ribs. Marjorie crossed the threshold of a private club, the air inside thick with the blue haze of cigar smoke and the medicinal tang of aged cognac. Henry Ward sat deep within a tufted leather chair, his fingers curled around a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid. Without a word of greeting, he slid a thick folder across the low table, revealing blueprints for a luxury condominium complex slated to be built on the site of one of the city's oldest public schools. Henry's polished Oxfords caught the soft light of the floor lamps as he calmly stated the price for the millions she needed. Marjorie stared at his manicured hands, which tapped a rhythmic beat on the mahogany, and felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The cost of saving New Detroit was her signature on a document that would effectively evict hundreds of children from their classrooms. She shoved the folder back toward him with a sharp, final motion, the sound of paper on wood cutting through the low murmur of jazz. Marjorie stood up, pulling her shoulders back and meeting Henry Ward's predatory gaze with a cold, level stare. Her voice remained steady, cutting through the heavy atmosphere as she informed him that she would never trade the future of her students for a budget fix. She watched as Henry's face settled into a mask of indifference, his eyes turning to flint. She grabbed her coat and walked toward the exit, refusing to look back at the man who had tried to buy her soul. Images of the children's faces, the ones whose school Henry wanted to bulldoze, flashed in her mind, and a hot spark of anger finally burned through the fog of her fear. Arthur Pratt stumbled into Marjorie's foyer, leaving a trail of gray, slushy mud across the ivory rug. He collapsed to his knees, his trembling hands clutching at the hem of her silk robe as if it were a life raft. His eyes were bloodshot from days without sleep, darting around the room in a feverish panic while he whispered a plea for her to alter the Foundation's digital registries. He gestured wildly toward her laptop, promising that a few keystrokes would hide the hole just long enough for him to win it all back. Marjorie felt the sour stench of old gin radiating from him and pulled away with a sharp twist of her body. Arthur's pathetic whimpering filled the quiet of her home, turning her sanctuary into an extension of the nightmare that had swallowed her professional life. The mayor sat on a park bench, his face partially obscured by the downward tilt of his hat and the high collar of his coat. A sharp autumn wind whipped dry leaves around Marjorie's feet, the sound like the rustling of old parchment. He didn't turn his head when she sat down beside him, his gaze fixed on the gray ripples of the pond. In a low, urgent tone, he told her about a shadow following every member of her staff, a private investigator hired by her political enemies to dig up filth. Marjorie saw the mayor's knuckles turn white as he gripped the head of his walking stick. Each word he spoke felt like a heavy stone dropping into a well, confirming that the walls were finally closing in on the new Detroit Foundation. Marjorie reached into her mailbox, and a heavy, square envelope slid into her palm, devoid of any return address. She tore it open, the sharp edge of the paper drawing a thin bead of blood from her thumb. Inside, she found a series of grainy photographs. Marjorie entering her home, Marjorie standing silhouetted in her bedroom window, Marjorie talking to Arthur. On the back of the final image, a jagged hand had scrawled a date, Sunday evening, along with a blunt demand for the return of the casino's money. A sickening, oily dread paralyzed her legs, and the air in her lungs felt thick and unbreathable. She scanned the empty street, every shadow and rustling bush suddenly appearing as a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She threw open the heavy door to the Foundation's server room, where the rhythmic blinking of blue and green LEDs cast a ghostly light over the racks. Arthur Pratt was hunched over the main terminal, his face sickly and pale in the glow of the monitor. His fingers flew across the keys, a desperate attempt to scrub the digital fingerprints of his theft from the internal logs. Marjorie heard the frantic clicking of the hard drives and the ragged, uneven hitch of Arthur's breath. When she stepped into the light, he jumped, nearly knocking over a stack of external drives. She saw the command prompt on the screen, lines of data representing weeks of transactions vanishing into the void. Her rage flared, white-hot and blinding, as she realized he was willing to destroy the Foundation's entire history to save his own skin. Marjorie's phone buzzed with a notification that a delivery had arrived at the Foundation's loading dock. She looked through the window to see a heavy truck idling, workers beginning to roll out pallets wrapped in tight, clear plastic. Beneath the sheen of the wrap, she recognized the spines of new history and mathematics textbooks, resources the Foundation had ordered but had no way to pay for. She checked the invoice in her inbox, the total highlighted in a bold, accusatory red. A lump formed in her throat as she imagined the textbooks being hauled away by bailiffs before a single child could crack a cover. She rested her forehead against the cold glass, watching the oblivious workers move with a purpose she no longer possessed. At the exit of the grocery store, a man in a nondescript gray overcoat blocked Marjorie's path. The private investigator didn't speak. He simply fanned out a series of high-resolution printouts that smelled of fresh toner. Marjorie stared at her own signature, bold and unmistakable, on the very transfer orders Arthur had slipped into her daily pile. The investigator adjusted his glasses, his gaze analytical and devoid of empathy, pinning her to the spot like an insect in a display case. The weight of the papers felt like lead in her hand, and the mention of an impending police inquiry caused her grip on her groceries to fail. The dull thud of apples rolling across the concrete sounded like the final gavel of a judge. Arthur moved closer to Marjorie, his voice dropping to a soft, manipulative purr that made her skin crawl. He spoke of the children's eyes, the ones who had finally received new uniforms and a sense of pride because of her work. He whispered that the truth would only result in the destruction of everything she had built, turning 20 years of service into a pile of ash. Marjorie looked down at her shaking hands as Arthur painted a picture of the noble lie, a deception that would keep the doors open and the children fed. He sketched a future where the foundation survived the audit through a few clever adjustments, leaving her to wonder if her integrity was worth the hunger of the city's youth. Marjorie crossed the threshold of the school's lobby, the air smelling of fresh floor wax and lemon oil. The morning of the anniversary gala hummed with the activity of security guards setting up velvet ropes and chrome stanchions. On her desk, nestled among a forest of floral arrangements, sat a heavy, unmarked envelope. She tore the seal, and a stack of glossy photographs spilled onto her lap. The images showed Arthur Pratt in the dim, neon-lit interior of an illegal gambling den, his face twisted with a manic intensity as he pushed stacks of red chips into the center of a table. In the background, a digital board displayed losses that made Marjorie's stomach turn. A cold sweat soaked her blouse, and the words on the celebratory banner behind her desk seemed to melt into a meaningless blur. She shoved the envelope into the deepest corner of her safe, the heavy steel door clicking shut with a finality that offered no comfort. Just as the lock engaged, Arthur burst into the room, his skin the color of wet ash and his tie yanked so tight it seemed to be choking him. He grabbed the edge of her desk, his teeth chattering against the rim of a water glass as he tried to speak. In a frantic, broken voice, he revealed that the federal audit team had arrived an hour early and were already unloading their equipment in the foyer. Marjorie felt the room begin to tilt, the rhythmic thud of the inspector's footsteps in the hall sounding like the slow, deliberate beat of a funeral drum. Marjorie slipped into the narrow service corridor behind the main office, avoiding the grand staircase where the early guests were already beginning to gather. The walls here were a dull, institutional gray, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low-frequency buzz. Suddenly, her lungs burned with the sharp, acrid scent of burning plastic and paper. Wisps of gray smoke were curling from beneath the heavy door of a storage closet located directly behind the stage of the assembly hall. She pressed a hand over her mouth, the heat from the door radiating against her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the flicker of orange light dancing in the gap between the door and the floor. She threw the door open, and a cloud of soot-heavy smoke billowed into her face, stinging her eyes. Inside the cramped space, Arthur was on his knees before a galvanized metal trash can, his shadow dancing wildly against the walls. Marjorie watched in horror as he tore apart the gold-embossed folders of the new Detroit Foundation, feeding the original financial reports into the rising flames. The documents curled and blackened, turning into gray flakes of ash before she could reach them. Arthur's eyes were wide and vacant, reflecting the fire, while a thick smear of soot marked his cheek like war paint. He was incinerating the only evidence of their legitimate work, turning decades of history into a pile of glowing refuse. Marjorie stripped off her wool blazer and lunged toward the fire, ignoring the heat that scorched her face. She draped the heavy fabric over the mouth of the trash can, pressing down hard to starve the flames of oxygen. Arthur fought her, his hands clawing at her arms as he tried to push her away. But she threw her entire weight onto the smoldering pile. The metal of the can burned her palms, even through the thick lining of the jacket, and she let out a sharp cry of pain. The smell of singed wool and expensive perfume filled the tiny room. Beneath her hands, the fabric began to smoke, but she refused to let go until the last hiss of the fire died out in the suffocating dark. Arthur collapsed onto the grimy floor, his head buried in his hands as a low, guttural wail escaped his throat. The smoke swirled around him, making his huddled form look like a ghost among the cleaning supplies. He screamed at Marjorie that he would throw himself from the fourth-floor window if she took those documents out of the room. He began to beat the back of his head against the concrete wall, sobbing for her to let the evidence burn to nothing. Flecks of foam flew from his lips as he swore his blood would be on her hands if the truth ever saw the light of day. Marjorie stared at the man who had been her closest ally, feeling a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in her chest. She made a sudden, predatory move and snatched the charred remains of the ledger from Arthur's weak grip. The paper was still hot, the burnt edges crumbling into black dust that stained her fingers and the sleeves of her dress. She clutched the folder to her chest like a shield, ignoring the fresh wave of hysterical sobs that broke from Arthur's throat. When he tried to grab her ankles, she stepped back with a sharp, forceful motion that sent him sprawling. The soot from his hands left dark, ugly smears on the silk of her skirt, but she didn't look back. His threats of self-destruction now sounded like nothing more than the empty whistling of wind through a hollow building. Beyond the thin wall of the closet, the school orchestra suddenly erupted into a triumphant fanfare. The blast of the trumpets and the roll of the drums pierced the silence of the storeroom, causing Marjorie to flinch. She heard the muffled voice of the master of ceremonies booming through the house speakers, introducing the visionary leader and savior of the city's youth. The roar of 1,000 clapping hands vibrated through the floorboards, a physical force that seemed to push against her. Marjorie looked down at her blackened hands and the ruin of her dress. The gap between the adulation in the hall and the filth in the closet, feeling like a canyon she couldn't hope to cross. Marjorie pulled back the edge of the heavy velvet curtain, peering into the blinding light of the auditorium. In the front row, she saw the polished, expectant faces of the city's power brokers, their white collars stark against their dark suits. The mayor and the governor were both standing, wearing practiced politician smiles as they held the edges of a massive ceremonial check. Flashbulbs popped, illuminating the gold lettering on the cardboard that promised millions for the foundation's expansion. The check looked like a tombstone to Marjorie, a monument to a lie that was about to be sanctified. The way the officials looked toward the stage, their eyes full of a shallow, calculated admiration, made her stomach turn. Arthur lunged forward and gripped her elbow with a strength born of pure desperation. His voice, now a low, venomous hiss, vibrated against her ear. He snarled that a single word about the theft would result in the immediate eviction of every orphan in their program and the bankruptcy of every teacher who had trusted them. Marjorie felt his fingers bruising her skin, a physical reminder of the trap they were both in. He spoke of the half-finished roofs and the empty cafeterias that would be the only legacy of her honesty. She looked at him and saw not a friend, but a mirror of the compromise she had been making for years. She stepped out onto the stage, and the focused heat of the spotlights hit her with the force of a physical blow. The audience became a vast, shimmering sea of blurred faces and evening wear, their applause rising to a deafening crescendo. Marjorie stood at the podium, her blackened fingers hidden beneath the ledge of the wood, the charred folder resting like a bomb in front of her. The silence that followed was absolute. A heavy, expectant void, waiting for her to fill it with the expected words of triumph. Marjorie felt the dry, prepared text of her speech crumble in her fist before she dropped it into the wastebasket beneath the lectern. The hum of the crowd died away, leaving her with a high-pitched ringing in her ears that seemed to drown out the world. Her lips felt like cold marble as she began to speak, not of milestones or success, but of empty accounts and her own catastrophic failure to see the truth. Each sentence fell into the silence of the hall like a stone into a deep, dark well. She watched the smiles in the front row vanish, replaced by a collective, frozen shock as glasses of champagne were lowered, forgotten. The air in the room grew thin and cold, and the glare of the lights caught the beads of sweat on her brow as she announced that the new Detroit Foundation was bankrupt. She raised a trembling hand, her finger pointing toward the heavy velvet curtain where Arthur Pratt had been hiding. The room erupted into a chaotic storm of shouting and the sound of hundreds of people rising at once. Marjorie watched through a haze as a forest of smartphones and news cameras swiveled toward the wings, the white, aggressive flashes of the bulbs blinding Arthur as he tried to retreat further into the shadows. He threw up an arm to shield his face, but the crowd was already surging toward the stage, their voices a discordant roar of betrayal. Somewhere in the back, the sound of breaking glass signaled the end of order. Arthur's face was a pale, terrified mask against the red fabric, while Marjorie remained at the microphone, feeling the first waves of a righteous, destructive anger wash over her. The mayor bolted from his seat, nearly upending his heavy chair as he scrambled toward the side exit. The governor was a half-step behind him, brushing at his sleeves as if the very air of the stage had become toxic. The ceremonial check, the one promising millions that didn't exist, was trampled underfoot, the mayor's heel tearing a jagged hole through the foundation's logo. Marjorie watched as a phalanx of security in dark suits formed a human wall, shoving reporters aside to clear a path for the fleeing politicians. The heavy thud of the exit doors echoing through the hall sounded like the closing of a tomb. Behind the stage, the sound of police radios and the rhythmic stomp of heavy boots announced the arrival of the authorities. Two officers in dark uniforms moved with clinical efficiency, wrenching Arthur's arms behind his back until the dry snap of metal handcuffs signaled his arrest. They dragged him down the center aisle, and Marjorie watched as her former colleagues, people she had worked with for a decade, leaned out to spit on him as he passed. An angry donor threw a crumpled program, the heavy paper striking Arthur in the temple and drawing a thin line of blood. His head lolled forward, his feet dragging uselessly across the expensive carpet as the officers hauled him toward the back. The air was thick with a chorus of insults and screams. Marjorie watched his retreating back until the heavy oak doors of the auditorium slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the gathering mob outside. Marjorie descended the stage steps, the sharp, lonely click of her heels sounding like gunshots in the rapidly emptying hall. The floor was a graveyard of discarded programs, broken glass, and silk scarves. As she approached the administrative wing, she saw a team of federal agents already unrolling rolls of bright yellow tape that read, "Seized." She stood motionless as a strip of plastic was slapped across the gold-lettered sign on her office door, effectively erasing her authority. The metallic, rhythmic thud of a heavy-duty stapler securing the notices to the frame made her flinch with every strike. The agents didn't look at her. They simply moved from room to room with a cold, bureaucratic precision, turning her life's work into a crime scene. At the main gates of the foundation, a solid wall of people blocked her exit. Marjorie recognized Miss Green, a veteran math teacher whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The teachers stood with their shoulders squared, their breathing heavy and synchronized in the cool night air. Miss Green stepped forward, her voice trembling as she called Marjorie a thief, accusing her of stealing the very hope they had spent years cultivating in the classrooms. Marjorie tried to speak, but the crowd pressed in, a wave of heat and hostility that forced her back. One of her former assistants reached up and tore a promotional poster of Marjorie from the fence, shredding the image and tamping the pieces into the mud at Marjorie's feet. A man with eyes as cold and gray as the Detroit River, the court-appointed liquidator, extended a tablet toward her. Marjorie's fingers left dark, soot-colored smudges on the screen as she traced her final signature, officially dissolving her connection to the organization. She reached into her bag and pulled out the heavy ring of office keys, dropping them into the man's open palm. The cold steel felt like ice against her skin. The muffled jingle of the keys hitting the bottom of his leather briefcase marked the end of her career. The man gave a short, professional nod. Marjorie turned and walked away from the building, feeling a strange, hollow lightness in her chest as the weight of the lie finally dissipated. She reached the porch of her small house and stopped, staring at the mountain of cardboard boxes piled haphazardly near the door. Protruding from the top of one was her framed master's degree, the glass shattered into a web of fine cracks. Her personal belongings, books, clothes, kitchenware, had been unceremoniously dumped onto the wet wooden slats of the porch. She saw her favorite ceramic mug lying in a dozen pieces near the railing. A sharp wind caught the pages of her old journals, fluttering them through the dirt. Someone had used a can of red spray paint to scrawl the word "liar" in jagged letters across the front of her home. Marjorie sank onto the top step, her hand brushing a silk scarf that smelled of smoke and the coming rain. A long shadow from the ancient elm tree in her yard stretched across the porch, and 4 figures emerged silently from the gloom of the garden. Marjorie recognized them instantly. The difficult boys from the toughest blocks of the city, the ones the Foundation was supposed to save. Tyrone and his friends stood in a semicircle, their oversized jackets damp from the mist. In their hands, they held battered, dog-eared textbooks and notebooks held together with thick rubber bands. Marjorie watched as Tyrone shifted the weight of a heavy history book, his expression unreadable. They didn't shout or throw stones. They simply stood there in the flickering light of the street lamp, the scent of damp earth and cheap tobacco clinging to their clothes. Tyrone stepped into the light, the yellow glow reflecting off his shaved head. He held out an old history volume, the gold lettering on the spine almost completely worn away. His voice was a low, steady rumble as he told Marjorie that they didn't want the mayor's shiny new computers if they were paid for with a lie. Marjorie reached out and took the book, her fingers tracing the rough, familiar texture of the library binding. Tyrone looked her in the eye and stated that the truth she told on that stage was worth more to them than any grant. Marjorie saw a flicker of genuine, hard-earned respect in his gaze, a look she had never seen from any donor or politician. She pulled the book to her chest, the trembling in her legs finally beginning to subside.